I never thought I would rush into my childhood home to find my 6-year-old daughter Emma sobbing with bloodied fingertips, while my sister Jessica casually explained she had just taught Emma a lesson about touching the antique piano. When I demanded answers through my shock and horror, my mother Patricia dismissed the entire incident as harmless fun and claimed Emma's fingers had no purpose anyway, since she clearly was not musically gifted like the rest of our family. My father Robert actually chuckled at the scene before him, calling Emma dramatic and insisting her fingers would grow back just fine. As I stared at my bleeding daughter surrounded by my family's callous indifference, I realized something fundamental about who these people really were, while quietly beginning to plan something they would never see coming. The drive to urgent care felt like an eternity as Emma whimpered in the passenger seat, her tiny hands wrapped in blood-soaked paper towels I had grabbed from my mother's kitchen. My mind raced between comforting my daughter and replaying the horrific scene I had walked into just 20 minutes earlier. I had dropped Emma off at my parents' house that morning for what was supposed to be a fun afternoon with her Aunt Jessica, while I attended a mandatory work meeting. The call came 2 hours later from Jessica herself, her voice eerily calm as she explained there had been a little accident with the piano. When I arrived at the house, I found Emma hunched over in the living room corner, tears streaming down her face as she cradled her right hand against her chest. The antique piano bench was overturned, and there were actual droplets of blood on the ivory keys. Jessica stood nearby examining her manicure as if nothing significant had occurred. The sight of my daughter's crushed fingernails, 3 of them split down to the quick, with blood still seeping from the wounds, sent a surge of protective rage through my entire body. During the careful questioning at urgent care, while the doctor cleaned and bandaged Emma's injuries, a much darker picture began to emerge. Through gentle probing and age-appropriate language, Emma revealed that this afternoon's incident was not isolated or accidental. Jessica had been systematically tormenting her during every single family visit for the past several months. The cruel behavior included pinching Emma under tables during family dinners, pulling her hair when adults were not looking directly at them, and telling her she was unwanted and stupid whenever they were alone together. Emma's voice became barely a whisper as she described how Jessica had convinced her to keep quiet about all the previous incidents by threatening much worse punishment if she ever told anyone what really happened during their time together. My daughter had been carrying this burden of fear and pain for months while I remained completely oblivious to her suffering. The weight of that realization crushed down on me as I held her small bandaged hand in mine. The doctor treating Emma's fingernails asked several pointed questions about the nature of this particular accident, his expression growing increasingly suspicious as I explained what little I knew about the piano lid incident. His professional demeanor suggested he had seen similar injuries before and understood the difference between genuine accidents and deliberate harm. When he asked to speak with me privately while Emma was getting X-rays to check for fractures, his concerns became more direct and specific. He explained that the pattern of Emma's injuries was consistent with someone deliberately slamming a heavy object down on her fingers while they were positioned on a flat surface. The crushing damage to multiple fingernails, the specific bruising patterns, and the depth of the lacerations suggested significant force had been applied intentionally. His questions about Emma's home environment and family relationships made it clear he was considering whether to involve Child Protective Services. Sitting in that sterile examination room, watching my brave little girl endure painful treatment for injuries inflicted by someone who was supposed to love and protect her, I realized how completely I had failed as her mother. I had trusted my family implicitly, leaving Emma alone with them countless times, without ever considering she might not be safe. The signs had probably been there all along, but I had missed them because I could not imagine my own sister being capable of such cruelty. As we left the medical center with Emma's hand properly bandaged and instructions for follow-up care, I began formulating a plan to protect my daughter and uncover the full extent of what had been happening. I would document everything from this point forward, gather evidence of Jessica's behavior, and make sure Emma never suffered alone in silence again. My family had no idea what they had just awakened in me, but they were about to find out exactly how far a mother would go to defend her child. The drive home was quiet except for Emma's occasional sniffles, but my mind was racing with possibilities and strategies. I had my phone ready to record any future interactions, and I was already planning to install hidden cameras in my parents' house during my next visit. Jessica's casual dismissal of Emma's pain and my parents' enabling response had revealed something fundamental about their character, and I intended to use that knowledge against them. That evening, after Emma was safely asleep with her injured hand carefully elevated on pillows, I began the most difficult research project of my life. Sitting at my kitchen table with my laptop and a growing sense of dread, I started making phone calls to people I had not spoken with in years. The picture that emerged from these conversations was more disturbing than anything I could have imagined about my own family. My first call was to Sarah Williams, who had been my closest friend during elementary school before her family moved away suddenly in 5th grade. When I finally tracked down her current phone number and explained why I was calling, there was a long silence before Sarah asked if I was really ready to hear what she had to say about Jessica. Her voice carried a weight of old pain as she described incidents I had either never witnessed or had forgotten completely. Sarah reminded me of the time Jessica had locked her in the basement storage room during a sleepover, leaving her there for 3 hours while I searched the house calling her name. When we finally found Sarah, she was hysterical with fear and claustrophobia, but Jessica claimed it had been an innocent game of hide-and-seek that went wrong. My parents had bought this explanation completely, even giving Jessica extra dessert that night for helping to look for our missing guest. There were other incidents Sarah remembered with crystal clarity that I had somehow blocked from my memory. Jessica pushing her off the tire swing in our backyard, resulting in a sprained ankle that Sarah's parents dismissed as clumsiness. Jessica hiding Sarah's inhaler during a severe asthma attack, then presenting herself as the hero when she miraculously found it 20 minutes later. Each story Sarah told made my stomach turn as I recognized the same patterns of deliberate harm disguised as accidents or childish pranks. My next call was to David Thompson, a neighbor boy who had been in Jessica's class throughout middle school. David's parents had moved the family across town abruptly when we were 13, and I had never understood why until now. David described a systematic campaign of psychological torture Jessica had inflicted on him, including spreading rumors about his family's financial struggles, sabotaging his school projects, and convincing other children to exclude him from social activities. The breaking point had come when Jessica somehow obtained David's house key and used it to enter his home while his family was away. She had destroyed his collection of baseball cards worth several $100s and arranged the destruction to look like his younger brother had done it out of jealousy. The resulting family conflict had been so severe that David's parents decided they needed a fresh start in a different neighborhood, away from Jessica's influence. But the most shocking revelation came when I called my cousin Rachel, who was 2 years younger than Jessica and had spent many summers at our house during childhood. Rachel's voice became shaky when I explained why I was calling, and she asked several times if I was sure I wanted to know the truth about those summer visits. When she finally began talking, I had to set the phone down and walk away twice because I could not process what I was hearing. Rachel described years of systematic abuse at Jessica's hands, including being forced to eat mud pies, being locked outside in severe thunderstorms, and being told elaborate lies about how our parents planned to send her to foster care because they found her annoying. Jessica had convinced Rachel that any complaints would result in her never being allowed to visit again, effectively silencing her through manipulation and fear tactics. The most horrifying part of Rachel's story was her description of how Jessica had trained the family dog to bite on command, then used this ability to terrorize Rachel during her visits. Jessica would corner Rachel in isolated parts of the house and threaten to sick the dog on her if she did not comply with various humiliating demands. Rachel still carried physical scars on her arms from the times Jessica had followed through on these threats. When I asked Rachel why she had never told any adults about Jessica's behavior, her answer chilled me to the bone. She explained that she had tried to tell her parents during one summer visit, but they had dismissed her concerns and actually called my parents to apologize for Rachel's lies and attention-seeking behavior. My parents had reassured Rachel's parents that Jessica was a perfect angel who would never hurt a fly, and that Rachel was probably just jealous of Jessica's natural leadership abilities. As the night wore on and I made more calls to former classmates, neighbors, and family friends, a clear pattern emerged that made me physically sick. Jessica had been systematically tormenting children for years, and my parents had been covering up her behavior just as consistently. Every incident was explained away as a misunderstanding, an accident, or the other child's fault for being too sensitive or prone to making up stories. Mrs. Henderson, who had lived next door to us for 15 years, remembered multiple occasions when parents had called to complain about Jessica's treatment of their children. Each time my parents had defended Jessica vigorously and suggested that the other children were lying or exaggerating because they were jealous of Jessica's confidence and popularity. Mrs. Henderson admitted she had stopped allowing her own grandchildren to play at our house because she did not trust Jessica around young children. The most damning information came from my Aunt Margaret, my father's sister, who had remained largely silent about family matters for decades. When I called her late that night and explained what had happened to Emma, Margaret's response was immediate and unequivocal. She'd been waiting years for someone to finally ask the right questions about Jessica's behavior, and she was ready to tell me everything she had witnessed and documented over the years. Margaret revealed that she had been keeping detailed records of Jessica's concerning behavior since childhood, including photographs, witness statements, and medical records related to suspicious injuries suffered by children in Jessica's presence. She had tried multiple times to raise concerns with my parents, only to be shut down and eventually excluded from family gatherings for being negative and unsupportive of Jessica's development. According to Margaret, my parents had created an elaborate system of denial and deflection that protected Jessica from any consequences for her actions, while systematically gaslighting anyone who tried to hold her accountable. They had convinced themselves that Jessica was simply strong-willed and that other children needed to learn how to handle her personality, rather than expecting her to modify her behavior. As I ended my final phone call that night, I realized that Emma's injuries were just the latest incident in a decades-long pattern of abuse that my family had been covering up and enabling. Jessica was not simply a troubled child who had grown into a difficult adult. She was a predator who had been systematically harming vulnerable children while our parents provided cover and protection for her actions. The scope of the conspiracy was breathtaking, and the number of victims was staggering. Sitting in my dark kitchen at 3 a.m, surrounded by pages of notes documenting years of cruelty and cover-ups, I understood that I was not just fighting to protect Emma from one incident. I was confronting a family system that had been built around enabling and protecting a predator, and that system would fight back with everything it had to maintain itself. The next morning, I called in sick to work and devoted the entire day to building a comprehensive case against Jessica and my parents. My first stop was the public library, where I could use their computers and internet access without leaving digital footprints on my own devices that my family might somehow discover. I had learned enough about Jessica's manipulative abilities to assume she might be monitoring my online activities somehow. My investigation began with social media platforms where I created fake accounts to search for any traces of Jessica's online presence. What I discovered exceeded my worst fears and made me physically nauseous as I scrolled through the evidence of her calculated cruelty. Jessica maintained several private social media accounts under variations of her name, and through careful searching and cross-referencing, I was able to gain access to her protected content. The private Instagram account I found contained dozens of photographs documenting Emma's previous injuries and distress, each one captioned with cruel commentary that treated my daughter's pain as entertainment. There were photos of Emma crying after being pinched, images of bruises on her arms from being grabbed too hard, and pictures of her looking terrified during family gatherings. Jessica had been systematically documenting her abuse of Emma like some kind of twisted trophy collection. But the most disturbing discovery was Jessica's participation in a private online group dedicated to sharing stories and images of child abuse. The group, which operated under an innocuous-sounding name related to parenting challenges, was actually a forum where predators shared techniques for hurting children while avoiding detection. Jessica was an active participant, sharing not only images of Emma, but also detailed descriptions of her methods for inflicting psychological and physical harm. The posts I read made me want to vomit as I realized the calculated nature of Jessica's abuse. She described Emma as her current project, detailing how she had been gradually escalating the severity of her attacks to see how much damage she could inflict before anyone noticed. The piano incident had been deliberately planned as a test to see whether I would finally take action to protect Emma or continue to enable the family's denial system. Other members of the group provided Jessica with suggestions for future abuse scenarios, including recommendations for causing injuries that would be difficult to trace back to intentional harm. The level of planning and premeditation involved in Jessica's treatment of Emma was staggering, and the group's encouragement and advice had clearly been influencing her escalating behavior. I screenshot every single post, comment, and image from Jessica's accounts before she could delete them, creating a comprehensive digital evidence file that documented years of calculated abuse. The timestamps on the posts correlated perfectly with Emma's unexplained injuries and behavioral changes that I had previously attributed to normal childhood accidents and phases. After securing the social media evidence, I drove to my parents' house while they were at work to install hidden recording devices throughout the main living areas. I used tiny wireless cameras designed for home security, placing them in positions where they would capture any interactions between Jessica and Emma during future visits. The installation took 2 hours, and I tested each device thoroughly to ensure they would provide clear audio and video documentation. While I was in the house, I also searched through Jessica's childhood bedroom, which my parents had preserved exactly as she had left it when she moved out for college. Hidden in her closet, I found journals dating back to elementary school that contained detailed plans for tormenting other children, including maps of our neighborhood, marking which houses contained potential victims, and notes about each child's specific fears and vulnerabilities. The journals read like instruction manuals for psychological warfare against children. Jessica had documented which tactics worked best on different personality types, how to manipulate adults into dismissing children's complaints, and strategies for escalating abuse without triggering intervention. She had been studying and perfecting her methods for hurting children since she was barely a child herself. In her high school journals, Jessica's entries became even more disturbing as she described her growing excitement about the power she held over younger children and her frustration with victims who tried to seek help from adults. She wrote extensively about training our parents to dismiss any complaints about her behavior by consistently portraying herself as the victim of other children's lies and jealousy. The most chilling entry I found was dated just 2 weeks before Emma's piano incident, where Jessica wrote about her growing boredom with Emma's predictable reactions and her desire to escalate to more severe physical harm. She described the piano lid scenario in detail, including her plan to dismiss it as an accident and her confidence that our parents would support her version of events regardless of the evidence. After copying all of Jessica's journal entries, I drove to Emma's school to speak with her teacher and the school counselor about any changes they might have noticed in her behavior over the past several months. Both educators immediately confirmed my growing suspicions, describing a noticeable decline in Emma's confidence and academic performance that had begun around the same time Jessica started spending more time with her. Emma's teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, had been particularly concerned about Emma's sudden fear of making mistakes and her tendency to flinch when adults raised their voices or made sudden movements. She had noticed Emma examining her hands frequently during class, as if checking for injuries, and had observed her becoming increasingly withdrawn from social interactions with other children. The school counselor had more specific concerns about Emma's recent artwork and creative writing assignments, which had begun featuring themes of helplessness, fear, and children being hurt by family members. Emma had drawn several pictures depicting a little girl hiding from a scary lady, and had written a story about a child whose fingers got hurt because she was bad and deserved punishment. Both school staff members were relieved when I explained the situation and asked them to document any future concerns about Emma's well-being. They agreed to maintain detailed records of any physical injuries, behavioral changes, or concerning communications from Emma, and they provided me with copies of all previous documentation they had compiled about her changing demeanor. My final stop that day was the medical center where Emma had been treated, where I requested complete copies of all records related to her care. The attending physician, Dr. Martinez, was willing to meet with me privately to discuss his concerns about the nature of Emma's injuries and provide a professional assessment that could be used in potential legal proceedings. Dr. Martinez confirmed that Emma's injuries were entirely consistent with deliberate assault rather than accidental harm, and he provided me with a detailed written report explaining the medical evidence supporting this conclusion. He also gave me referrals to specialists in child abuse cases who could provide additional expert testimony if needed for legal action. By the end of that first day of investigation, I had compiled a comprehensive evidence file that included digital records of Jessica's online abuse documentation, physical journals detailing her methods, and planning hidden camera footage of her threatening Emma witness statements from school personnel and medical evidence of deliberate harm. The case against Jessica was overwhelming and undeniable, but I knew that my parents would still find ways to deny and deflect responsibility for their role in enabling her behavior. As I sat in my car outside the medical center that evening, organizing all the evidence I had gathered, I realized that I had enough documentation to pursue criminal charges against Jessica and potentially my parents as well. But I also understood that legal action alone would not protect Emma from future harm or address the deeper family dysfunction that had allowed this abuse to continue for so long. The next phase of my plan would require confronting my parents directly with the evidence and forcing them to choose between protecting Jessica and acknowledging the truth about their family's systematic failure to protect vulnerable children. 3 days after the piano incident, I arranged to meet my parents at their house for what I described as an important family conversation about Emma's accident. I'd spent hours preparing for this confrontation, organizing the evidence into a clear and compelling presentation that would be impossible for them to dismiss or deflect. My goal was to give them one final opportunity to do the right thing before I took more drastic action to protect Emma and expose the truth. I arrived at the house with 2 large binders containing printed copies of all the evidence I had gathered along with my laptop to show them the digital components of Jessica's online activities. Patricia and Robert were waiting in the living room, their expressions suggesting they expected this meeting to be about my overreaction to a simple childhood accident rather than a serious discussion about systematic abuse. I began by presenting the medical evidence showing them Dr. Martinez's detailed report explaining why Emma's injuries were inconsistent with accidental harm. I watched their faces carefully as I read the professional assessment describing the deliberate nature of the trauma to Emma's fingernails and the force required to cause such specific damage patterns. Their expressions remained carefully neutral, showing neither surprise nor concern about the medical findings. Next, I showed them printed screenshots of Jessica's social media posts documenting her abuse of Emma, including the photographs she had taken of previous injuries and the cruel captions describing Emma's pain as entertainment. I expected them to be horrified and shocked by this evidence of their daughter's calculated cruelty, but instead, they examined the images with detached curiosity, as if they were looking at pictures of someone else's family. When I showed them excerpts from Jessica's journals detailing her plans for escalating abuse and her strategies for manipulating adults into dismissing children's complaints, I finally got a reaction from them. But it was not the horror and remorse I had expected. Instead, Patricia smiled slightly and nodded approvingly as she read Jessica's descriptions of her tactical approaches to handling difficult children. The moment of truth came when I played the hidden camera footage I had captured during Jessica's most recent visit to their house. The video clearly showed Jessica cornering Emma in the kitchen, grabbing her injured hand roughly, and threatening to hurt her much worse if she ever told anyone else about their special games. Jessica's voice was crystal clear as she described the creative ways she planned to punish Emma for being a crybaby about the piano incident. I expected this irrefutable evidence of deliberate child abuse to finally break through their denial and force them to confront the reality of Jessica's behavior. Instead, Patricia and Robert exchanged a knowing look before Patricia spoke in a calm, matter-of-fact tone that chilled me to the bone. She explained that they had always been fully aware of Jessica's special methods for dealing with difficult children, and that they considered her approach to be highly effective for teaching kids, like Emma, important lessons about resilience and respect for authority. Patricia described Emma as being excessively sensitive and dramatic traits that reminded her of my own weaknesses as a child, and she believed Jessica's firm guidance was exactly what Emma needed to develop proper character. Robert nodded in agreement, adding that he found Emma's reactions to Jessica's discipline genuinely amusing because they reminded him of how I used to overreact to normal childhood corrections. He explained that Emma needed to learn how to handle adversity without running to adults for protection, and that Jessica's techniques were helping to build the kind of mental toughness Emma would need to succeed in the real world. As I sat there processing their casual admission that they had been deliberately enabling Jessica's abuse while knowing exactly what she was doing, Patricia continued speaking in the same conversational tone she might use to discuss the weather. She revealed that they had been coaching Jessica on how to escalate her methods gradually to avoid triggering intervention from outside authorities, and that they considered the piano incident to be a perfectly calibrated lesson in consequences. The conversation took an even darker turn when Robert explained their long-term strategy for managing my potential interference with Jessica's educational approach. They had anticipated that I might eventually object to their methods, and they had been preparing for this confrontation by building a case against my fitness as a parent. Over the past several months, they had been documenting what they described as my helicopter parenting tendencies and emotional instability, creating a file they could use to challenge my custody of Emma if necessary. Patricia showed me a folder containing photographs they had taken of Emma, appearing happy and well-adjusted during family visits before I arrived to pick her up, along with notes about my allegedly paranoid and overprotective behavior during recent interactions. They had been systematically building a narrative that painted me as an unstable single mother who was projecting my own childhood trauma onto normal family discipline situations. When I demanded to know how they could justify deliberately enabling the systematic abuse of their own granddaughter, Patricia's response revealed the true depth of their dysfunction. She explained that Emma's pain and fear were necessary components of her character development, and that my attempts to protect her from these valuable learning experiences were actually harmful to her long-term well-being. Robert added that they had raised Jessica using similar methods, and that her strength and confidence as an adult proved the effectiveness of their approach. He described my objections to their parenting philosophy as evidence of my own fundamental weakness, and suggested that Emma would be better off being raised by people who understood the importance of discipline and resilience training. The conversation concluded with a direct threat disguised as family concern. Patricia explained that if I continued to make trouble about Jessica's interactions with Emma, they would be forced to take legal action to protect Emma from my unstable influence. They had already consulted with attorneys about pursuing grandparents' rights and had been advised that my documented history of mental health struggles and single-parent status would work against me in custody proceedings. Robert added that they had significant financial resources available to fund a prolonged legal battle, while I would be forced to rely on overworked public defenders, who would be no match for their high-powered legal team. They were confident that any court would recognize their superior ability to provide Emma with a stable two-parent home environment compared to my chaotic single-mother household. As I packed up my evidence and prepared to leave their house, I realized that I had been naive to expect any form of accountability or remorse from people who had spent decades perfecting a system of abuse and cover-ups. They were not in denial about Jessica's behavior. They were active participants in planning and enabling it. The confrontation had not revealed the extent of their dysfunction. It had confirmed that they were deliberate conspirators in the systematic abuse of children. Driving home that evening, I understood that traditional approaches like family therapy or intervention would be completely useless against people who saw child abuse as an effective parenting strategy. My parents had made their choice to protect and enable Jessica while threatening to destroy me if I continued trying to protect Emma. They had declared war on my ability to keep my daughter safe, and they clearly believed their superior resources and planning would guarantee their victory. But what they did not understand was that their threats and casual dismissal of Emma's suffering had finally freed me from any obligation to protect their reputation or preserve family relationships. They had shown me exactly who they really were. And now I could proceed with a clear conscience to use every weapon at my disposal to expose their conspiracy and ensure that Emma would never suffer at their hands again. The morning after my confrontation with my parents, I decided to reach out to my extended family for support and validation. I believed that once other relatives understood what was happening to Emma, they would stand with me against Jessica's abuse and my parents' enabling behavior. I was completely unprepared for what I discovered when I began making those phone calls. My first call was to my cousin Lisa, who had always been like an older sister to me during childhood. Lisa lived 3 states away now, but we had maintained regular contact through social media and holiday cards. When I explained the situation with Emma and Jessica, Lisa's response was immediate and devastating. She told me that my mother had been calling family members for weeks, expressing deep concern about my mental health and my increasingly unstable behavior toward Emma. According to Lisa, Patricia had painted a picture of me as a single mother struggling with depression and paranoid delusions, who was becoming dangerously obsessed with imaginary threats to Emma's safety. Patricia had described my accusations against Jessica as projection of my own childhood trauma, and explained that she and Robert were considering legal intervention to protect Emma from my deteriorating mental state. Lisa gently suggested that I might benefit from professional counseling to work through whatever issues were causing me to see abuse where none existed. She reminded me that Jessica had always been wonderful with children and that my parents were devoted grandparents who would never allow harm to come to Emma. The conversation ended with Lisa promising to pray for my recovery and urging me to seek help before I did something that would permanently damage my relationship with the family. My next call was to my uncle Steve Roberts' younger brother, who'd been my favorite relative during childhood. Steve's response was even more crushing because it revealed the depth and sophistication of my parents' manipulation campaign. He explained that Robert had shared detailed documentation of my alleged mental health crisis, including photographs of Emma appearing frightened in my presence, and recordings of me making what Robert described as paranoid accusations against innocent family members. Steve had been told that I was suffering from postpartum depression that had evolved into a more serious psychological condition involving delusions and inappropriate anger toward family members. According to the story my parents had constructed, I had become convinced that everyone was conspiring against Emma, and I was becoming increasingly aggressive and irrational in my interactions with people who tried to help. The most painful part of Steve's call was his description of how worried the entire family was about Emma's well-being in my care. He explained that multiple relatives had discussed the possibility of staging an intervention to convince me to seek psychiatric treatment before I caused serious harm to my daughter through my paranoid behavior. As I continued calling family members throughout the day, the same pattern emerged over and over again. Every single relative I contacted had received detailed briefings from my parents about my alleged mental health crisis and the danger I posed to Emma's emotional development. They had been told that my accusations against Jessica were symptoms of a serious psychological breakdown that required professional intervention. My Aunt Carol, who lived in the same town as my parents, provided the most detailed account of their manipulation campaign. She explained that Patricia had been hosting coffee meetings with various family members over the past 2 months, sharing carefully edited documentation that supported her narrative about my declining mental health. The evidence included photographs taken out of context, recorded phone conversations, edited to make me sound irrational, and written statements from Jessica describing my allegedly aggressive behavior during family visits. Carol showed genuine concern for my well-being as she described the family's plan to stage a coordinated intervention that would convince me to enter voluntary psychiatric treatment. If I refused their help, they had prepared legal documentation that would support emergency custody proceedings to remove Emma from my care while I received mandatory mental health treatment. The sophistication of their preparation was breathtaking. They had consulted with attorneys about the legal requirements for demonstrating parental unfitness, and they had been systematically building a case that would satisfy those requirements. Every interaction I had with family members over the past several months had been documented and interpreted through the lens of mental illness and parental inadequacy. When I called Emma's school to check on any communications they might have received from family members, my worst fears were confirmed. The school principal, Dr. Wilson, explained that my mother had contacted them several weeks earlier to express concern about Emma's emotional state and my ability to provide stable parenting. Patricia had described my recent behavior as increasingly erratic and had suggested that the school monitor Emma for signs of neglect or emotional abuse. Patricia had provided the school with documentation supporting her concerns, including photographs of Emma appearing distressed after spending time with me, and written statements from family members describing my inappropriate responses to normal childhood incidents. She had positioned herself as a concerned grandmother trying to protect Emma from an unstable parent while maintaining family unity. Dr. Wilson admitted that the school staff had been quietly observing my interactions with Emma and documenting any concerning behaviors they witnessed. They had been instructed to watch for signs that I was coaching Emma to make false statements about family members, or that I was projecting my own fears and anxieties onto normal childhood experiences. The most devastating revelation came when I learned that my parents had also contacted Emma's pediatrician with similar concerns about my mental health and parenting abilities. Dr. Foster explained that Patricia had requested a meeting to discuss what she described as Emma's declining emotional health under my care. She had presented medical documentation allegedly showing that Emma's recent injuries and behavioral changes were consistent with a child living in a chaotic and emotionally unstable household. Patricia had suggested that Emma's claims about being hurt by family members were actually cries for help related to my inappropriate parenting, rather than factual reports of abuse. She had recommended that the medical practice begin monitoring Emma more closely for signs of emotional manipulation and coach testimony that might indicate I was using her as a weapon against family members I perceived as threats. As I processed the scope of my family's manipulation campaign, I realized they had been preparing for my eventual rebellion against their system for months. They had anticipated that I would eventually object to Jessica's treatment of Emma, and they had spent considerable time and resources building a comprehensive defense strategy that would discredit any accusations I might make. Every family member, school official, and medical professional in Emma's life had been systematically manipulated into believing that I was an unstable parent, whose perceptions could not be trusted. They had created an echo chamber of concern about my mental health that would make it nearly impossible for anyone to take my accusations seriously or offer me support in challenging Jessica's abuse. The isolation was complete and devastating. I had no family allies, no institutional support, and no credible voice in defending either Emma's safety or my own parental fitness. My parents had successfully positioned themselves as the stable, responsible adults trying to protect Emma from my allegedly dangerous delusions while painting me as the primary threat to her well-being. That evening, as I sat in my kitchen reviewing all the ways my family had systematically undermined my credibility and support systems, I understood that I was facing a much more sophisticated enemy than I had initially realized. This was not simply a matter of confronting one abusive family member, but rather challenging an entire conspiracy that had been carefully planned and executed over many months. My parents had weaponized my love for Emma against me using my protective instincts as evidence of mental illness, while positioning themselves as the rational adults trying to save Emma from my harmful influence. They had turned my greatest strength as a mother into my greatest vulnerability, and they had done it so skillfully that even people who cared about me genuinely believed I was the problem. But what they had not anticipated was that their manipulation campaign had also revealed the true scope of their capabilities and resources. If they were willing to invest this much time and energy into destroying my credibility to protect Jessica's ability to abuse Emma, then the stakes were much higher than I had originally understood. This was not just about one incident or even one abusive relationship, but about a family system that was completely committed to enabling and protecting predatory behavior regardless of the cost. 2 weeks after my failed attempt to gain family support, I received a call from my mother that filled me with immediate dread. She explained that the family had decided to move forward with a coordinated intervention for my mental health crisis, and that they had arranged for a family therapy session with Dr. Anderson, a respected psychologist who specialized in family conflict resolution. Patricia's voice carried a tone of forced concern as she explained that everyone was worried about my recent behavior and wanted to help me work through whatever issues were causing me to make such serious accusations against Jessica. She emphasized that this was not meant as punishment, but as an opportunity for healing and reconciliation that would benefit everyone, especially Emma. The therapy session was scheduled for the following Saturday at Dr. Anderson's office, and Patricia made it clear that Emma's attendance was non-negotiable. She explained that Dr. Anderson needed to observe our family dynamics firsthand in order to provide appropriate recommendations for moving forward. When I objected to exposing Emma to what I knew would be a coordinated attack on my credibility, Patricia's tone became firm and threatening. She reminded me that the family had already documented extensive evidence of my deteriorating mental health and inappropriate parenting decisions. If I refused to participate in this therapeutic intervention, they would have no choice but to pursue legal remedies to protect Emma from my continued instability. The therapy session was my opportunity to demonstrate my commitment to getting help and rebuilding healthy family relationships. I spent the week leading up to the appointment preparing for what I knew would be an ambush designed to further undermine my credibility while strengthening their case against me. I gathered all of my evidence about Jessica's abuse and my parents' enabling behavior, hoping that a mental health professional would be able to see through their manipulation tactics and recognize the truth about our family dynamics. On the morning of the appointment, I arrived at Dr. Anderson's office with Emma, who had been unusually quiet during the drive there. My parents and Jessica were already waiting in the reception area, their expressions conveying the appropriate mixture of concern and sadness that the situation had deteriorated to this point. Jessica was particularly convincing in her role as the worried aunt who just wanted what was best for her beloved niece. Dr. Anderson was a middle-aged woman with a calm, professional demeanor who seemed genuinely interested in helping our family work through its difficulties. She began the session by explaining that she had received extensive background information from my parents about the recent family conflicts and that her goal was to help everyone communicate more effectively and find solutions that would protect Emma's well-being. The first part of the session involved each family member describing their perspective on recent events, and I quickly realized how carefully orchestrated this intervention had been. My parents spoke eloquently about their concerns for my mental health and their desire to help me get appropriate treatment while maintaining Emma's stability. They described specific incidents where my behavior had been irrational or concerning, presenting a compelling case for their worry about my parenting capabilities. Jessica's performance was masterful as she described her genuine love for Emma and her confusion about why I had suddenly become so hostile toward their relationship. She spoke tearfully about wanting to maintain her close bond with her niece, while respecting whatever boundaries I needed to feel comfortable. Her portrayal of herself as an innocent victim of my paranoid accusations was convincing and emotionally manipulative. When it was my turn to speak, I presented the evidence I had gathered about Jessica's systematic abuse of Emma, including the photographs from her social media accounts and excerpts from her journals documenting her planned escalation of violence. I explained the medical evidence showing that Emma's injuries were deliberate rather than accidental, and I described my parents' admission that they had been enabling Jessica's behavior while threatening legal action against me. Dr. Anderson listened politely to my presentation, occasionally taking notes and asking clarifying questions. However, I could see that she was interpreting my detailed documentation and careful preparation as further evidence of the obsessive paranoid thinking my family had already described to her. My thoroughness and organization were being read as symptoms of mental illness rather than evidence of genuine concern for my daughter's safety. The session took a dramatic turn when Dr. Anderson asked to speak with Emma privately to assess her emotional state and gather her perspective on the family conflicts. During this individual session, which lasted about 30 minutes, I could hear Emma's voice through the office walls, but could not make out specific words. When they emerged from the private conversation, Emma looked confused and upset in a way that immediately alarmed me. Dr. Anderson's demeanor had shifted noticeably after her conversation with Emma, and she requested to speak with my parents and Jessica privately before reconvening the full family session. During their private consultation, which lasted nearly an hour, I sat in the waiting room with Emma trying to understand what had happened during her individual session. Emma was reluctant to talk about her conversation with Dr. Anderson, but she eventually revealed that the doctor had asked very specific questions about whether I had ever coached her to say negative things about Jessica or whether I had ever hurt her while claiming someone else had done it. Emma had been confused by these questions because they seemed to suggest that I was the source of her injuries rather than Jessica. When the family session reconvened, Dr. Anderson's recommendations revealed the success of my family's manipulation campaign. She explained that while family conflicts were always challenging, she was particularly concerned about what appeared to be a pattern of projection and displacement that was putting Emma at risk of psychological harm. Dr. Anderson's assessment was that I was experiencing a serious mental health crisis that was causing me to perceive threats where none existed and to interpret normal family interactions as abusive. She recommended immediate psychiatric evaluation and possible medication to address what she described as paranoid ideation and inappropriate anger toward family members who were trying to help. Most devastatingly, Dr. Anderson recommended that Emma's contact with me be temporarily supervised while I received mental health treatment. She suggested that my parents were the appropriate supervisors given their demonstrated concern for Emma's well-being and their stable, supportive relationship with her. As we prepared to leave the office, Jessica offered to take Emma home with her for the weekend to give me time to process Dr. Anderson's recommendations and schedule the psychiatric evaluation that had been suggested. My parents strongly supported this plan, emphasizing that Emma needed stability and protection while I worked through my mental health issues. Despite my objections and Emma's obvious reluctance, the pressure from Dr. Anderson's professional recommendation and my parents' threats of legal action left me feeling that I had no choice but to agree to the supervised visitation arrangement. I was assured that this was a temporary measure designed to help our family heal, and that Emma would be returned to me once I had demonstrated progress in addressing my mental health concerns. The drive home without Emma was the longest of my life, as I processed how completely I had been outmaneuvered by my family's coordinated strategy. They had successfully used the mental health system to legitimize their narrative about my unfitness as a parent, while positioning themselves as Emma's protectors and advocates. But what happened next revealed that their confidence in their control over the situation had led them to make a critical error in judgment. Late Sunday evening, I received a frantic call from Emma, who had managed to reach my phone while Jessica was in the shower. Through tears and whispered words, she described how Jessica had deliberately pushed her down the concrete steps outside my parents' house, causing her to hit her head and injure her wrist. Emma explained that Jessica had made sure no adults were watching before shoving her down the steps, then immediately began screaming for help and claiming that Emma had tripped because she was upset about being away from me. By the time my parents and neighbors responded to Jessica's calls for help, the scene had been completely staged to support the narrative of Emma being clumsy and emotionally distressed rather than deliberately harmed. When I arrived at the hospital emergency room where Emma was being treated for a concussion and broken wrist, I found my family already assembled and presenting a united front about the tragic accident that had occurred. Jessica was playing the role of the devastated aunt who blamed herself for not watching Emma more carefully, while my parents were expressing concern about Emma's emotional state and its contribution to her clumsiness. The medical staff were clearly suspicious about Emma's injuries, especially given the recent piano incident and the escalating pattern of harm she had experienced. However, my family's coordinated response and Dr. Anderson's recent assessment of my mental health created a complex dynamic that worked against my credibility as Emma's advocate. Dr. Peterson, the emergency room physician treating Emma, pulled me aside to express his concerns about the pattern of injuries Emma had sustained and his growing suspicion that she was being systematically harmed. However, he also acknowledged that the recent psychological evaluation questioning my stability created complications in terms of determining who might be responsible for Emma's continued injuries. As I sat beside Emma's hospital bed that night, watching her sleep with her head bandaged and her arm in a cast, I realized that Jessica's escalation had finally provided me with the undeniable evidence I needed to prove that Emma was being deliberately harmed. The medical documentation of her injuries combined with Emma's own account of being pushed created a clear case for intervention that even my family's manipulation campaign could not completely obscure. But I also understood that Jessica's willingness to cause such serious injuries during a supposedly supervised visit meant that she was no longer concerned about maintaining the facade of accidents and misunderstandings. She was confident enough in her protection from my parents and the mental health system that she believed she could harm Emma with impunity. The escalation meant that Emma was in immediate and serious danger, and that traditional approaches through family therapy or gradual intervention would not be sufficient to protect her from increasingly severe abuse. Jessica's behavior had crossed the line from psychological manipulation into potentially life-threatening violence, and I had to respond with equal seriousness and determination to ensure Emma's survival. 3 days after Emma's hospital discharge, while she was still recovering from her concussion and adjusting to the cast on her broken wrist, I made a discovery that shattered my remaining faith in the possibility of protecting her through normal channels. The revelation came during what should have been a routine follow-up appointment with Emma's pediatrician to monitor her healing progress. Dr. Foster had requested a private conversation with me after examining Emma's injuries, and her expression indicated that she had discovered something deeply troubling during the medical assessment. She explained that while conducting the standard examination required after suspected abuse cases, she had noticed physical signs that suggested Emma might be experiencing additional forms of trauma beyond the obvious injuries. With careful professional language, Dr. Foster described indicators that Emma had potentially been subjected to inappropriate sexual contact. The physical evidence was subtle, but concerning enough to warrant immediate further investigation by specialists trained in identifying and documenting such abuse. She recommended that Emma be evaluated by the Regional Children's Advocacy Center, which had specialized equipment and expertise for conducting sensitive examinations of potential sexual abuse victims. The room seemed to spin around me as I processed what Dr. Foster was telling me. The systematic physical and psychological abuse I had already documented was horrific enough, but the possibility that Jessica had escalated to sexual abuse created a level of danger that required immediate and decisive action to protect Emma from further harm. That evening, after Emma had gone to bed early due to her lingering concussion symptoms, I sat down with her for the most difficult conversation of my life. Using age-appropriate language and following the guidelines Dr. Foster had provided, I gently asked Emma about any inappropriate touching or secret games that adults might have asked her to participate in. Emma's initial response was confusion and denial, which Dr. Foster had warned me to expect given the sophisticated grooming techniques typically used by family abusers. However, as our conversation continued and I reassured Emma that she would not be in trouble for telling the truth about anything that had happened to her, a much darker picture began to emerge. Through halting words and obvious distress, Emma revealed that Jessica had indeed been engaging in inappropriate touching during their private time together. Jessica had presented these interactions as special bonding activities that demonstrated their unique relationship, and she had convinced Emma that this was normal behavior between aunts and nieces who truly loved each other. Jessica had been careful to frame the abuse as educational, explaining to Emma that she was teaching her important information about her body that would help her understand how to be a grown-up. She had used seemingly innocent games and activities to gradually introduce more invasive touching while conditioning Emma to accept increasingly inappropriate contact as normal and loving. Most devastatingly, Jessica had been documenting these interactions through photographs and videos, which she told Emma were special memories of their bonding time together. She had convinced Emma that these images were proof of their love for each other, and that sharing them with anyone else would ruin their special relationship forever. The sophisticated psychological manipulation Jessica had used to groom Emma was as disturbing as the physical abuse itself. She had systematically undermined Emma's understanding of appropriate boundaries while creating a framework of secrecy and shame that would make disclosure extremely difficult. Emma had been trained to believe that the abuse was evidence of love and that revealing it would cause harm to the family relationships she valued. As Emma continued describing Jessica's grooming tactics, I realized that the sexual abuse had been carefully planned and executed over many months as part of a deliberate escalation strategy. The physical abuse and psychological manipulation had been preparation for this ultimate violation designed to break down Emma's resistance and create vulnerability that Jessica could exploit. The revelation that Jessica had been creating photographic documentation of her sexual abuse of Emma added another layer of horror to an already unthinkable situation. Not only had she been violating Emma directly, but she had been creating permanent records of that violation that could be used to further traumatize Emma, or potentially distributed to other predators. When I asked Emma about where these photographs might be stored, she described Jessica using a special camera that immediately sent pictures to a computer, suggesting that digital evidence of the sexual abuse might be stored on Jessica's electronic devices or shared through online networks similar to the abuse documentation I had already discovered on social media. The next morning, I called Dr. Foster to report Emma's disclosure and schedule the specialized examination that would be needed to document the sexual abuse and support potential criminal charges against Jessica. Dr. Foster immediately contacted the Children's Advocacy Center and arranged for Emma to be seen that same day by their team of experts in child sexual abuse cases. The examination at the Children's Advocacy Center was conducted with extraordinary sensitivity and care by professionals who specialized in working with traumatized children. The physical evidence they documented confirmed that Emma had indeed been sexually abused, and their report provided the detailed medical documentation that would be needed for criminal prosecution. During the forensic interview conducted by trained specialists, Emma was able to provide much more detailed information about the scope and timeline of Jessica's sexual abuse. The interview was recorded using specialized equipment that would preserve Emma's testimony in a format that could be used in court proceedings without requiring her to testify repeatedly about her traumatic experiences. The forensic interviewer explained that Emma's account of the abuse was consistent with typical patterns of interfamilial sexual abuse, including the gradual escalation of contact, the use of educational frameworks to normalize inappropriate behavior, and the creation of photographic documentation for the abuser's collection and potential distribution. Most importantly, Emma's disclosure during the forensic interview provided specific information about where Jessica stored the digital evidence of her crimes and how she had been sharing this material with other predators through encrypted online networks. This information would be crucial for law enforcement's investigation and for identifying other potential victims of Jessica's abuse. As I sat in the Children's Advocacy Center that afternoon, holding Emma while she recovered from the stress of the examination and interview, I understood that we had finally reached the point where traditional family interventions and therapeutic approaches were completely inadequate for protecting her safety. Jessica was not simply a troubled family member who needed help managing her behavior. She was a dangerous predator who had been systematically grooming and abusing Emma, while creating documentation that could facilitate additional exploitation. The sexual abuse represented an escalation that could not be addressed through family therapy or gradual boundary setting. The evidence gathered by the medical and forensic specialists provided the foundation for immediate criminal charges against Jessica, and the documentation of my parents' knowledge and enabling of her behavior created the possibility of charges against them as well. For the first time since this nightmare began, I had institutional support and professional validation of the danger Emma faced. But I also understood that pursuing criminal charges would trigger a fierce response from my family's legal and financial resources, and that they would use every available tactic to discredit Emma's testimony and destroy my credibility as her advocate. The battle for Emma's safety was about to escalate into a comprehensive war that would determine whether a child's right to protection could overcome a family's wealth and influence. The Children's Advocacy Center provided me with information about legal resources available to support families pursuing criminal charges in child sexual abuse cases, including specialized attorneys who worked on contingency fees and victim advocacy organizations that could provide ongoing support throughout the legal process. That evening, as I helped Emma prepare for bed and tried to create a sense of normalcy, despite the trauma of the day's revelations, I made the decision that would define the rest of our lives. I would pursue criminal charges against Jessica, regardless of the personal cost, and I would fight my family's attempts to silence Emma's voice with every resource at my disposal. Emma deserved justice for the horrific abuse she had endured, and other children deserved protection from Jessica's predatory behavior. The evidence we had gathered could not only stop Jessica from continuing to harm Emma, but could also prevent her from victimizing other children in our family and community. The breaking point had been reached, and there was no possibility of reconciliation or compromise with people who would sexually abuse a child while systematically covering up their crimes. The only path forward was complete exposure of the truth and full accountability for the years of abuse Emma had suffered at their hands. The morning after Emma's forensic examination, I received an unexpected phone call that would transform my understanding of Jessica's history and provide the alliance I desperately needed to protect Emma effectively. The caller was Janet Morrison, a woman whose voice I did not recognize, but whose story would prove that Emma was not Jessica's first victim. Janet explained that she had seen the news coverage of my family's situation and recognized Jessica's name from her own daughter's traumatic experiences 5 years earlier. Her daughter Chloe had been in Jessica's Sunday school class at the church my parents attended, and Janet had spent years trying to get church leadership to investigate Jessica's inappropriate behavior with the children in her care. According to Janet, Jessica had been systematically grooming and abusing children in her Sunday school class for at least 2 years before parents began comparing notes about their children's concerning behavioral changes and reluctance to attend church activities. When Janet and other parents tried to raise concerns with church leadership, they were told that Jessica came from a highly respected family and that the children's accounts were likely exaggerations or misunderstandings. Janet's daughter, Chloe, had eventually disclosed sexual abuse by Jessica, but the church's investigation had been handled internally and resulted in Jessica quietly leaving her position without any formal acknowledgement of wrongdoing or notification to law enforcement. The church leadership had been convinced by my parents' arguments that the allegations were unfounded and that pursuing them would damage the reputation of a faithful family. As Janet continued describing her experience trying to get justice for Chloe, I realized that my family had been using their financial influence and social connections to cover up Jessica's abuse for years. The church investigation had been compromised from the beginning because my parents were major donors who had threatened to withdraw their support if the allegations against Jessica were pursued aggressively. Janet provided me with contact information for 3 other mothers whose children had been abused by Jessica during her time at the church, and she explained that they had formed an informal support network to help their families heal from the trauma. All of these mothers had been intimidated into silence through various forms of legal and social pressure orchestrated by my parents. My first call was to Maria Santos, whose son, Diego, had been in Jessica's Sunday school class during the same period as Chloe. Maria's account of Jessica's abuse tactics was strikingly similar to what Emma had experienced, including the same patterns of physical intimidation, psychological manipulation, and sexual grooming disguised as educational activities. Maria explained that Diego had disclosed Jessica's abuse after developing severe behavioral problems and academic difficulties that his teachers attributed to trauma. However, when Maria tried to report the abuse to both church authorities and law enforcement, she encountered a coordinated campaign of character assassination that destroyed her credibility and left her feeling powerless to protect her son. My parents had hired private investigators to dig into Maria's background and discover that she had struggled with depression following her divorce. This information was used to suggest that Diego's allegations were the result of coaching by an unstable mother who was projecting her own relationship difficulties onto innocent interactions between Jessica and the children in her care. The third mother, Linda Chen, described how my parents had used their legal connections to threaten her family with deportation proceedings if she continued pursuing allegations against Jessica. Linda's husband was in the country on a work visa, and my parents had leveraged their relationships with immigration attorneys to suggest that causing trouble for respected community members could result in visa complications that would destroy their family's American dream. The most shocking revelation came from the fourth mother, Dr. Patricia Williams, a respected pediatrician whose professional reputation had been systematically destroyed after she documented medical evidence of Jessica's abuse of her daughter. Dr. Williams explained that my parents had used their wealth and connections to file frivolous malpractice suits against her practice and spread rumors about her competence that ultimately forced her to relocate to another state. As I spoke with each of these mothers, I realized that my family had perfected a sophisticated system for silencing Jessica's victims that combined legal intimidation, financial pressure, character assassination, and social manipulation. Each mother had been isolated and discredited, using tactics specifically tailored to their individual vulnerabilities and circumstances. But what my parents had not anticipated was that their pattern of victim intimidation had created a network of potential allies who were eager for an opportunity to seek justice for their children's abuse. Each mother I spoke with expressed relief that someone was finally pursuing criminal charges against Jessica and offered to provide whatever support might be needed to ensure her prosecution. Dr. Williams was particularly valuable as an ally because her medical expertise provided credibility that would be difficult for my family to discredit, and her documentation of Jessica's abuse patterns could establish a clear history of criminal behavior spanning multiple victims over many years. She had maintained detailed records of her daughter's injuries and psychological trauma despite the professional attacks she had endured. Maria Santos offered to connect me with a legal aid organization that specialized in representing families who could not afford private attorneys to pursue criminal cases against wealthy defendants. The organization had experience dealing with defendants who used their resources to intimidate victims and had developed strategies for protecting witnesses from retaliation during legal proceedings. Janet Morrison revealed that she had been secretly documenting Jessica's continued involvement with children through various volunteer activities and social organizations, and that she had evidence suggesting Jessica was still actively abusing children in the community. Her surveillance had uncovered that Jessica volunteered at a local youth mentoring program and had been building relationships with vulnerable children from single-parent families. Most importantly, Linda Chen had maintained contact with other families from the church whose children had exhibited signs of abuse, but who had been too intimidated to report their experiences. She believed that a coordinated effort to encourage these families to come forward could provide the critical mass of victims needed to overcome my family's intimidation tactics. During our group conference call later that week, the 5 mothers developed a strategic plan for supporting each other through the criminal justice process while protecting our children from retaliation. We agreed to coordinate our interactions with law enforcement and prosecutors to ensure that Jessica's pattern of abuse was clearly established across multiple victims and timeframes. Dr. Williams volunteered to serve as our medical expert witness and help connect us with other professionals who specialized in child abuse cases and were willing to stand up to wealthy defendants who tried to intimidate expert witnesses. Her medical credentials and documentation would be crucial for establishing the long-term psychological damage Jessica had inflicted on multiple children. The Alliance also provided emotional support that had been completely missing during my isolated struggle to protect Emma. For the first time since this nightmare began, I was working with other mothers who understood exactly what I was experiencing and who could validate my perceptions about Jessica's dangerous behavior and my family's enabling tactics. Together, we had enough documented evidence of Jessica's systematic abuse to support criminal charges that could result in significant prison time, and we had the collective strength to resist the intimidation tactics my family would inevitably use to try to silence us. The strategic preparation phase had transformed my lonely fight into a coordinated campaign for justice. As we concluded our planning session, I realized that my decision to pursue criminal charges against Jessica had connected me with a community of survivors who had been waiting for an opportunity to hold her accountable for years of abuse. Emma's courage in disclosing her abuse had finally created the opening that would allow all of Jessica's victims to seek justice together. The week following my alliance with the other mothers marked the beginning of the most intensive investigation of my life, as we worked together to compile a comprehensive evidence file that would support criminal charges against Jessica and potentially my parents as well. The scope of documentation we uncovered exceeded anything I had imagined about the depth and duration of Jessica's predatory behavior. Our first breakthrough came when Dr. Williams used her medical contacts to obtain records from multiple hospitals and clinics where Jessica's victims had been treated over the years. The pattern of injuries documented in these medical files was unmistakable, with several children exhibiting similar types of trauma that had been explained as accidents or behavioral problems rather than systematic abuse. Janet Morrison's surveillance of Jessica's recent activities had uncovered her involvement with a youth mentoring organization called Bright Futures, where she had been working with at-risk children for the past 18 months. Janet's documentation included photographs of Jessica with potential new victims and records of her communications with the program coordinators that revealed concerning patterns in her approach to selecting and grooming vulnerable children. When we contacted the director of Bright Futures to share our concerns about Jessica's history, we discovered that my parents had made substantial donations to the organization specifically to support Jessica's mentoring work. The director, Mr. Harrison, admitted that he had received reports of concerning behavior from some of the children Jessica worked with, but that he had been reluctant to investigate further because of the family's generous financial support. The most damaging evidence we uncovered came from Maria Santos's computer forensics expert, who had been helping her document Jessica's online activities related to child exploitation. The expert had traced Jessica's digital footprint through multiple platforms and discovered that she was an active participant in several networks dedicated to sharing child abuse material and coordinating the systematic exploitation of children. The digital evidence included not only the photographs and videos Jessica had taken of her abuse of Emma and other children, but also extensive communications with other predators where she shared techniques for grooming victims and avoiding detection by parents and authorities. Her online activity revealed that she viewed child abuse as a sophisticated game, where the challenge was to inflict maximum damage while maintaining plausible deniability. But the most shocking discovery came when we obtained access to financial records that revealed the true scope of my parents' involvement in covering up Jessica's crimes. Linda Chen's immigration attorney had connections with white-collar crime specialists who were able to trace suspicious financial transactions that suggested my parents had been paying substantial amounts of money to silence Jessica's victims and their families over many years. The financial investigation revealed a pattern of payments disguised as consulting fees, charitable donations, and educational scholarships that coincided with incidents of reported abuse by Jessica. My parents had created an elaborate system for buying silence that involved shell companies, offshore accounts, and complex legal agreements designed to prevent victims from speaking publicly about their experiences. Most devastatingly, we discovered that my parents had been systematically documenting their own cover-up activities, maintaining detailed records of their payments to victims' families and their strategies for discrediting anyone who threatened to expose Jessica's behavior. They had treated their protection of Jessica like a business operation complete with cost-benefit analyses and risk assessments for different approaches to managing potential exposure. The financial records also revealed that Jessica had been blackmailing my parents for years, using her knowledge of their tax evasion schemes and business fraud to ensure their continued protection of her abusive behavior. She had documented their illegal activities just as meticulously as she had documented her own crimes, creating a mutual blackmail system that guaranteed their cooperation in covering up her predatory behavior. Robert's company records showed evidence of embezzlement spanning more than a decade, with funds being redirected to personal accounts and used to finance the family's abuse cover-up operations. Patricia had been filing fraudulent insurance claims for years, creating additional sources of income that could be used to silence victims and buy legal protection for Jessica's crimes. The complexity of their criminal conspiracy was staggering, involving multiple forms of fraud, tax evasion, bribery, and obstruction of justice that had been coordinated over many years to protect Jessica's ability to abuse children with impunity. The financial evidence alone would be sufficient to support serious criminal charges against both parents, even without their direct involvement in the child abuse itself. Dr. Williams' analysis of Jessica's psychological profile based on her interactions with multiple victims over many years revealed that she exhibited classic characteristics of a sociopathic predator who derived pleasure from both the abuse itself and the challenge of maintaining her facade as a respected community member. Her escalating behavior suggested that she was becoming increasingly reckless and potentially dangerous as she grew more confident in her family's ability to protect her. The digital forensics expert had also discovered evidence that Jessica was planning to relocate to another state where she could establish new identities and continue her predatory behavior without the complications of her existing victim network. She had been researching volunteer opportunities with children's organizations in several different cities and had begun creating false documentation to support applications for positions that would give her access to vulnerable children. When we shared our compiled evidence with the district attorney's office, the response was immediate and decisive. The prosecutor assigned to handle Jessica's case, Assistant District Attorney Karen Mitchell, explained that the documented pattern of abuse, spanning multiple victims over many years, provided the foundation for charges that could result in life imprisonment without possibility of parole. Ada Mitchell was particularly interested in the financial evidence demonstrating my parents' systematic obstruction of justice, as these charges could be pursued even if Jessica attempted to flee the jurisdiction. The federal implications of their money laundering and tax evasion activities meant that multiple law enforcement agencies would be involved in ensuring that the entire family faced accountability for their crimes. The evidence compilation phase had transformed our initial focus on protecting Emma from one abusive family member into a comprehensive criminal investigation that would expose decades of systematic child abuse, financial fraud, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. The scope of documentation we had assembled would support charges against all 3 family members and potentially lead to the identification of additional victims who had been silenced through intimidation and bribery. As we prepared to move forward with formal criminal charges, I realized that the evidence-gathering process had also created an irreversible commitment to seeing this fight through to its conclusion, regardless of the personal cost. There was no longer any possibility of quiet family resolution or private therapy arrangements that would allow my parents to maintain their reputation while addressing Jessica's behavior behind closed doors. The comprehensive nature of our evidence meant that Jessica would face serious prison time, and my parents would lose their wealth, social status, and freedom as consequences for their decades of enabling and covering up child abuse. The investigation had reached the point where justice for Emma and all of Jessica's other victims was not only possible, but inevitable. 3 days after presenting our evidence to the district attorney's office, I received a phone call that would prove to be the final piece of the puzzle in building an unassailable case against my family's criminal conspiracy. The caller was my Aunt Margaret Roberts' sister, who had been conspicuously absent from all family discussions about my alleged mental health crisis and Emma's supposed accidents. Margaret's voice was steady but filled with emotion as she explained that she had been waiting for someone in the family to finally take meaningful action against Jessica's behavior, and that my decision to pursue criminal charges had given her the courage to reveal information she had been secretly gathering for more than 20 years. When Margaret arrived at my house that evening carrying 3 large storage boxes filled with documentation, I was unprepared for the scope and detail of the evidence she had been systematically collecting throughout Jessica's childhood and adult life. She had been documenting every incident of abuse, every cover-up attempt, and every financial transaction related to silencing victims since Jessica was 8 years old. Margaret explained that she had begun keeping records after witnessing Jessica torture and kill several neighborhood cats during a family barbecue when she was still in elementary school. When Margaret had tried to raise concerns about Jessica's behavior with my parents, they had accused her of jealousy and threatened to cut off all family contact if she continued making trouble about Jessica's normal childhood development. The documentation Margaret had maintained included photographs of Jessica's animal victims' witness statements from neighbors who had observed concerning behavior and copies of veterinary records showing suspicious patterns of injuries to pets in our neighborhood during Jessica's childhood. She had also documented the family's moves to different neighborhoods whenever complaints about Jessica became too numerous to ignore. Margaret's files contained copies of school records showing Jessica's history of violence against other students, including incidents that had been covered up through my parents' donations and legal interventions. She had documented at least 12 occasions when Jessica had been expelled or suspended from schools for violent behavior, only to have my parents successfully pressure administrators to reverse their decisions or remove the incidents from official records. The most valuable evidence Margaret provided was financial documentation, showing the true scope of my parents' criminal activities over the past 2 decades. As Robert's sister, she had maintained access to family business records and had been quietly copying evidence of tax evasion, money laundering, and fraud that extended far beyond their efforts to protect Jessica from accountability. Margaret revealed that Robert had been systematically stealing from his business partners and clients for years using complex financial schemes to hide millions of dollars in offshore accounts that funded the family's abuse cover-up operations. Patricia had been filing fraudulent insurance claims not just for personal benefit, but as part of an organized conspiracy that involved multiple family members and business associates. But Margaret's most devastating revelation concerned the true reason for my parents' protection of Jessica's abusive behavior. She explained that Jessica had been blackmailing them since her teenage years, using her knowledge of their criminal activities to ensure they would cover up her increasingly violent behavior toward other children. The blackmail arrangement had evolved into a sophisticated criminal partnership, where Jessica provided my parents with information about potential victims' families that could be used for additional fraud schemes, while my parents provided Jessica with financial resources and legal protection that enabled her to escalate her abusive behavior without consequences. Margaret had documented communications between my parents and Jessica, showing their coordination in identifying vulnerable children whose families could be manipulated or intimidated into silence. They had specifically targeted children from single-parent households, immigrant families, and economically disadvantaged backgrounds, because these families were less likely to have resources to fight back against wealthy defendants. The evidence Margaret had collected also revealed that my family's criminal conspiracy extended beyond child abuse cover-ups to include systematic fraud against insurance companies, tax authorities, and business partners that had generated millions of dollars in illegal profits. These funds had been used not only to silence abuse victims, but also to purchase political influence and legal protection that made their criminal activities nearly undetectable. When Margaret contacted the other mothers in our alliance to share her documentation, the response was immediate recognition that we finally had the comprehensive evidence needed to ensure convictions against all 3 family members. Dr. Williams confirmed that Margaret's medical documentation of Jessica's childhood violence matched patterns described in forensic psychology literature about developing sociopathic behavior. Maria Santos's legal aid contacts were amazed by the quality and completeness of Margaret's financial evidence, explaining that white-collar crime cases typically failed because investigators could not trace complex money laundering schemes back to their original sources. Margaret's 20-year documentation effort had created a complete roadmap of my parents' criminal activities that would be nearly impossible for defense attorneys to challenge. Janet Morrison realized that Margaret's evidence explained why her own efforts to pursue justice for her daughter had been so systematically undermined, as my parents had been using their criminal network's resources to destroy the credibility of anyone who threatened Jessica's freedom to continue abusing children. Linda Chen was particularly excited about Margaret's immigration-related documentation, which revealed that my parents had been using fraudulent visa applications and illegal employment schemes as part of their broader criminal activities. This evidence would trigger federal immigration fraud charges that carried mandatory minimum sentences and could not be dismissed through local political connections. But the most important aspect of Margaret's alliance with our group was her insider knowledge of my family's current activities and future plans. She revealed that my parents were preparing to flee the country with Jessica if criminal charges were filed, and that they had already transferred substantial assets to offshore accounts in preparation for permanent relocation to countries without extradition treaties. Margaret's information about their escape plans enabled Ada Mitchell to request immediate travel restrictions and asset freezes that would prevent my family from disappearing before their trials. She also provided contact information for federal investigators who had been building cases against my parents' business associates and would be eager to use our evidence to expand their prosecutions. The coordination between our local criminal case and federal investigations into my parents' financial crimes created a comprehensive legal strategy that would ensure accountability even if individual charges were somehow dismissed or reduced. Margaret's evidence had connected Jessica's child abuse to a larger criminal conspiracy that involved multiple felonies and federal jurisdictions. As our expanded alliance finalized preparations for the criminal charges to be filed, Margaret revealed one final piece of information that would prove crucial for protecting Emma and other potential victims during the legal proceedings. She had discovered that my parents had been secretly recording conversations with family members for years, including detailed recordings of my supposed mental health crisis and Emma's disclosures about Jessica's abuse. These recordings, which my parents planned to use as evidence of my instability and Emma's coach testimony, actually contained clear evidence of Jessica's guilt and my parents' knowledge of her crimes. Margaret had obtained copies of these recordings before my parents could edit them, and they would provide irrefutable proof of the family's conspiracy to cover up child abuse. The alliance that had begun with desperate mothers trying to protect their children had evolved into a comprehensive investigation team, supported by medical experts, financial specialists, federal investigators, and an insider witness with decades of documentation. Margaret's decision to finally reveal the evidence she had been collecting transformed our fight from a local custody dispute into a federal criminal case that would expose the full scope of my family's criminal activities. That evening, as I reviewed Margaret's documentation and prepared for the media attention that would inevitably follow the filing of criminal charges, I realized that Emma's courage in disclosing her abuse had triggered an avalanche of accountability that would extend far beyond our individual family situation. The evidence we had compiled would protect countless future victims from Jessica's predatory behavior while ensuring that my parents faced serious consequences for decades of enabling and covering up child abuse. The morning of Tuesday, October 15th, marked the beginning of the most intense media attention our community had experienced in decades when Ada Mitchell announced the filing of comprehensive criminal charges against Jessica, Robert, and Patricia for child abuse, conspiracy, fraud, and racketeering. The press conference she held outside the courthouse drew reporters from 3 states and created a firestorm of public attention that would transform our quiet suburb into the center of a national conversation about wealth privilege and the protection of child predators. Ada Mitchell's presentation of the charges was methodical and devastating, as she described the scope of Jessica's systematic abuse of children, spanning more than 15 years, supported by a sophisticated criminal conspiracy involving financial fraud, tax evasion, and obstruction of justice orchestrated by my parents. The evidence she presented included medical documentation from multiple victims' financial records, showing millions of dollars in illegal transactions, and recorded communications proving the family's coordination in covering up Jessica's crimes. The local television stations had been provided with advance copies of selected evidence that could be broadcast without violating privacy laws protecting the child victims, including photographs of Jessica's online communications with other predators and documentation of my parents' fraudulent business practices. The visual evidence was so compelling that even viewers with no knowledge of our family's background could immediately understand the severity of the crimes involved. But what Ada Mitchell and our alliance had not anticipated was the massive public response that would follow the initial news coverage of the charges. Within hours of the press conference, the district attorney's office began receiving phone calls from additional victims and witnesses who had been silent for years, but were now encouraged to come forward by the comprehensive nature of the evidence being presented. The first new victim to contact authorities was Thomas Richardson, now a 32-year-old attorney who had been abused by Jessica when he was 10 years old during a church summer camp she had supervised 18 years earlier. Thomas had never reported the abuse because his family had been financially dependent on employment with one of my father's business associates, and he had been convinced that speaking out would destroy his family's economic security. Thomas's account of Jessica's abuse tactics matched the patterns documented by Emma and the other known victims, but his adult perspective and professional training enabled him to provide detailed information about the legal and financial intimidation tactics my family had used to silence potential witnesses. His testimony would be particularly valuable because he could articulate the long-term psychological damage caused by both the abuse itself and the systematic effort to discredit his experience. The second new victim was Rebecca Martinez, a 25-year-old teacher who had been abused by Jessica during high school when Jessica had been hired as her private tutor. Rebecca had disclosed the abuse to her parents at the time, but they had been convinced to remain silent by a combination of financial incentives and legal threats that made prosecution seem impossible. Rebecca's parents, Carlos and Elena Martinez, contacted our alliance to apologize for their failure to protect their daughter and to offer their support for the current prosecutions. They revealed that my parents had threatened to have Carlos deported and Elena fired from her job at the school district if they pursued charges against Jessica, while simultaneously offering to pay for Rebecca's college education as compensation for keeping the abuse secret. The third new victim was David Park, a 19-year-old college student who had been abused by Jessica just 2 years earlier when she had been volunteering at his high school's peer counseling program. David's case was particularly important because it demonstrated that Jessica had continued her predatory behavior even after several previous victims had tried to expose her crimes, showing that my parents' cover-up efforts had enabled ongoing abuse of additional children. But the most shocking new disclosure came from Jennifer Walsh, a 28-year-old social worker whose family had been neighbors of ours during Jessica's teenage years. Jennifer revealed that she had been systematically abused by Jessica for 3 years during middle school, and that her attempts to seek help had been met with such sophisticated gaslighting and intimidation that she had convinced herself the abuse had been consensual experimentation between children. Jennifer's professional training in recognizing abuse patterns had eventually helped her understand that her experiences with Jessica constituted systematic sexual assault, but she had remained silent because she believed the statute of limitations had expired and that prosecution would be impossible without corroborating evidence. Each new victim who came forward brought additional witnesses and documentation that expanded the scope of evidence available to prosecutors, creating an overwhelming case that would be impossible for even the most skilled defense attorneys to challenge effectively. The pattern of abuse was so consistent across victims and time periods that any attempt to claim the allegations were fabricated or coordinated would be immediately disproven by the independent nature of each disclosure. The media coverage also triggered responses from community members who had witnessed suspicious behavior or had been approached by my family with requests to provide false testimony about various incidents. Mrs. Patterson, who had been our next-door neighbor for 10 years, came forward to describe multiple occasions when she had observed Jessica abusing children in our backyard and had been intimidated into silence by threats of legal action. Mr. Davidson, who had been Robert's business partner until a falling out 3 years earlier, provided investigators with additional evidence of the financial crimes my parents had used to fund their abuse, cover-up operations. His documentation included copies of fraudulent contracts, forged documents, and communications, proving that my parents had been systematically stealing from clients and business associates for more than a decade. The cascade of new evidence and witnesses created logistical challenges for the prosecution team, but it also transformed what had originally been a difficult case involving wealthy defendants with excellent legal representation into an overwhelming demonstration of systematic criminal behavior that would be nearly impossible to defend against. Local news stations began running nightly updates about the case that drew national attention from cable news networks and investigative journalism programs. The contrast between my family's respectable public image and the horrific reality of their criminal activities created a compelling narrative that resonated with audiences across the country. Social media discussions about the case generated thousands of comments from people sharing their own experiences with family abuse and institutional cover-ups, creating a broader conversation about how wealth and social status can be used to protect predators from accountability. The hashtag Justice for Emma began trending on multiple platforms as people expressed support for the victims and outrage about the systematic nature of the cover-up. The overwhelming public response to our case also attracted attention from investigative journalists who began examining whether similar patterns of abuse and cover-ups existed in other wealthy families and institutions throughout the region. Several newspapers assigned teams of reporters to investigate related cases and examine whether my family's criminal network included additional victims and co-conspirators. Perhaps most importantly, the media coverage reached other families who had been intimidated into silence by my parents' threats and legal maneuvering over the years. When these families realized that comprehensive criminal charges were being pursued and that multiple victims were speaking out together, they found the courage to contact authorities and provide additional evidence that further strengthened the prosecution's case. The exposure phase had transformed our fight for justice from a local family dispute into a regional scandal that would ultimately lead to broader reforms in how child abuse cases involving wealthy defendants are investigated and prosecuted. The media attention had created accountability pressure that made it impossible for my family to use their previous tactics of intimidation and bribery to escape consequences for their crimes. As I watched the evening news coverage showing Jessica being arrested at the airport with false identification documents while attempting to flee to a non-extradition country, I realized that our decision to pursue comprehensive criminal charges had created a tipping point that made justice inevitable rather than just possible. The trial proceedings began 6 months after the initial arrests with Jessica, Robert, and Patricia, facing a combined total of 47 criminal charges, ranging from child sexual abuse and assault to racketeering, money laundering, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. The courtroom was packed daily with supporters of the victims' media representatives and legal observers who recognized this case as a landmark example of how systematic child abuse by wealthy families could finally be prosecuted effectively. Jessica's defense team, led by renowned criminal attorney Marcus Webb, had spent months preparing what they believed would be a successful strategy to discredit the victim's testimony and challenge the admissibility of the evidence our alliance had gathered. Their approach was based on portraying me as an unstable single mother who had coached Emma to lie about abuse, while suggesting that the other victims were motivated by financial incentives to join a coordinated attack against my family. The defense's opening statement attempted to paint Jessica as the victim of a conspiracy orchestrated by vengeful family members and opportunistic parents who saw an opportunity to extract money from a wealthy family through false accusations. Attorney Webb spent 2 hours describing my alleged mental health issues and suggesting that my influence had corrupted Emma's perception of normal family interactions. However, the defense strategy immediately began to unravel when Ada Mitchell presented the comprehensive digital evidence of Jessica's online activities and communications with other predators. The detailed records of Jessica's participation in child exploitation networks combined with the photographs and videos she had created, documenting her abuse of multiple victims, made it impossible to maintain any claim of innocence or misunderstanding. The prosecution's presentation of Margaret's 20-year documentation of Jessica's criminal behavior was devastating to the defense's credibility, as her evidence included contemporaneous records of incidents that had occurred years before Emma was even born. Margaret's testimony about witnessing Jessica's childhood violence against animals and other children established a clear pattern of predatory behavior that could not be explained as recent fabrication or coaching. Dr. Williams' expert testimony about the medical evidence of sexual abuse was particularly powerful because her professional credentials and detailed documentation made her testimony unassailable, even under aggressive cross-examination. When Jessica's attorney attempted to suggest that the medical findings could have alternative explanations, Dr. Williams calmly explained why the specific patterns of trauma could only have resulted from deliberate sexual assault. The trial took a dramatic turn during the third week when Thomas Richardson testified about his abuse experience and provided detailed information about the legal and financial intimidation tactics my family had used to silence him and his parents. His adult perspective and professional training as an attorney enabled him to articulate exactly how my parents had used their wealth and connections to obstruct justice and enable continued abuse. But the most devastating moment for the defense came when Jessica's attorney made the strategic error of calling me to testify as a hostile witness, apparently believing that my alleged mental health issues would make me an unreliable narrator who would damage the prosecution's case. Instead, my testimony provided an opportunity to walk the jury through the comprehensive evidence our alliance had gathered and explain how my family's systematic cover-up had enabled Jessica's escalating abuse of Emma. Under cross-examination, I was able to demonstrate my complete competence and credibility while describing the sophisticated manipulation tactics my family had used to isolate me from potential support systems and undermine my ability to protect Emma. My calm, detailed responses to aggressive questioning made it clear that the defense's portrayal of me as an unstable conspiracy theorist was completely unfounded. The prosecution's presentation of financial evidence showing my parents' criminal activities created additional problems for the defense because it demonstrated that the family had motive and resources to obstruct justice through systematic intimidation of witnesses and potential victims. The complexity and scope of their money laundering operations proved that they were sophisticated criminals rather than grieving grandparents trying to protect their family's reputation. Jessica's decision to testify in her own defense proved to be a catastrophic mistake that sealed her conviction and destroyed any remaining credibility for her family's defense strategy. Under direct examination by her attorney, Jessica attempted to portray herself as a loving aunt who'd been misunderstood by troubled children and vindictive family members. However, during cross-examination by Ada Mitchell, Jessica's sociopathic personality became immediately apparent to the jury as she showed no genuine remorse for the documented harm she had caused to multiple children. When confronted with photographic evidence of her abuse and recordings of her threatening Emma, Jessica's responses revealed a complete lack of empathy and an arrogant confidence that she should not be held accountable for her actions. Most devastatingly, Jessica made several statements during her testimony that directly contradicted the defense's claims about her innocence, essentially admitting to behavior that constituted criminal abuse while attempting to justify her actions as appropriate discipline or education. Her testimony provided the prosecution with additional evidence that could be used to support the most serious charges against her. The defense's attempt to present character witnesses on Jessica's behalf backfired spectacularly when several of these witnesses admitted under cross-examination that they had been unaware of Jessica's documented history of violence and had based their positive opinions on her carefully maintained public facade, rather than any genuine knowledge of her behavior with children. The jury deliberations lasted only 18 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges against Jessica, including the most serious counts of aggravated sexual abuse that carried mandatory life sentences. The jury also convicted Robert and Patricia on all conspiracy, fraud, and obstruction of justice charges, finding that they had been active participants in covering up Jessica's crimes rather than innocent family members trying to protect their daughter. During the sentencing phase, Ada Mitchell presented victim impact statements from Emma and the other children who had been abused by Jessica, along with their families, who had been terrorized and intimidated by my parents' systematic cover-up efforts. The emotional testimony about the long-term psychological damage caused by both the abuse itself and the family's efforts to silence victims created a powerful case for maximum sentences. The judge's sentencing decisions reflected the severity of the crimes and the systematic nature of the conspiracy that had enabled them to continue for so many years. Jessica received 4 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole, ensuring that she would never again have the opportunity to harm children. Robert received 25 years in federal prison for his financial crimes and conspiracy charges, while Patricia received 20 years for her role in the cover-up and her own fraudulent activities. The judge's statement during sentencing specifically addressed the role that wealth and social privilege had played in enabling these crimes to continue for so long, noting that the family's resources had been systematically used to obstruct justice and silence victims, rather than to address Jessica's dangerous behavior or provide support for the children she had harmed. The legal victory was complete and comprehensive, with all 3 defendants receiving sentences that would effectively end their ability to harm children or use their wealth to escape accountability for their crimes. The civil asset forfeiture orders that accompanied their criminal convictions would ensure that their illegal profits were confiscated and used to provide restitution to victims and fund programs to support other survivors of family abuse. As I sat in the courtroom listening to the judge pronounce the final sentences, I realized that Emma's courage in disclosing her abuse had ultimately led to justice, not only for her, but for all of Jessica's victims, spanning more than 15 years. The legal system had finally held wealthy predators accountable for their crimes and demonstrated that no amount of money or social status could protect people who systematically abused children. The months following the sentencing brought a series of consequences that extended far beyond the prison terms imposed on Jessica Robert and Patricia, creating lasting changes that would protect future victims and provide meaningful support for the survivors of their systematic abuse. The comprehensive nature of their criminal conspiracy had triggered federal investigations and civil proceedings that would strip away every advantage their wealth and social status had previously provided. The federal asset forfeiture case resulted in the seizure of virtually all property and financial accounts connected to my family's criminal activities, including the family mansion, Robert's business interests, offshore bank accounts, and even Patricia's jewelry collection that had been purchased with fraudulent insurance proceeds. The total value of seized assets exceeded $4 million, representing the largest forfeiture in our county's history. Ada Mitchell worked with federal prosecutors to ensure that the forfeited assets were distributed as restitution to Jessica's victims and their families, providing meaningful financial compensation for the medical expenses, therapy costs, and educational disruption they had experienced as a result of the abuse and subsequent cover-up efforts. Emma received a substantial college fund that would ensure her educational opportunities, despite the loss of her grandparents' financial support. The other victims' families received compensation packages that reflected both the severity of their children's trauma and the financial resources their families had expended trying to seek justice against my family's intimidation tactics. Thomas Richardson and Rebecca Martinez both received significant settlements that acknowledged the courage they had shown in coming forward, despite years of being silenced through threats and manipulation. The criminal convictions also triggered professional consequences for my parents that destroyed their remaining social standing and institutional influence in our community. Robert's professional licenses were revoked, his business partnerships were dissolved, and his membership in various civic organizations was terminated. Patricia lost her positions on several charity boards and social committees that had previously provided platforms for her community influence. The church where Jessica had abused multiple children conducted an internal investigation that resulted in policy changes requiring background checks for all volunteers and mandatory reporting training for staff members. The church also provided financial support for counseling services for the families whose children had been harmed during Jessica's time in leadership positions. Bright Futures. The youth mentoring organization where Jessica had been grooming new victims implemented comprehensive reforms to their volunteer screening processes and supervision protocols. The organization also established a victim advocacy program that provided specialized support for children who'd been harmed by volunteers or staff members. The school district where Patricia had used her influence to silence complaints about Jessica's behavior conducted a comprehensive review of their reporting policies and created new procedures to ensure that allegations of abuse by community members would be investigated thoroughly regardless of the accused person's social status or financial contributions to school programs. The media attention surrounding our case had also inspired legislative changes at the state level, including new laws requiring mandatory reporting by financial professionals who suspected assets were being used to obstruct justice in child abuse cases. The legislation, which became known as Emma's Law, created specific penalties for using wealth to intimidate victims and witnesses in abuse cases. Perhaps most importantly, the comprehensive exposure of my family's criminal activities had eliminated their ability to harm additional children or use their resources to escape accountability for future crimes. Jessica's life sentences ensured that she would never again have access to vulnerable children, while my parents' financial ruin and criminal records made it impossible for them to resume their pattern of enabling and covering up abuse. The civil lawsuits filed by several victims' families resulted in additional consequences for the broader network of professionals and institutions that had facilitated my family's cover-up efforts. The private investigators my parents had hired to intimidate victims faced professional sanctions and criminal charges for their unethical conduct, while some of the attorneys who had helped structure illegal financial schemes faced disciplinary proceedings. The impact of these comprehensive consequences extended beyond our immediate case to influence how similar situations would be handled in the future. Law enforcement agencies throughout the region implemented new protocols for investigating abuse allegations involving wealthy defendants, ensuring that financial resources could not be used to obstruct investigations or intimidate witnesses. The local bar association conducted educational seminars for attorneys about the ethical obligations involved in defending clients accused of child abuse, emphasizing that zealous advocacy could not include tactics designed to intimidate victims or obstruct justice. Several attorneys who had previously represented my family faced disciplinary proceedings for their role in the systematic cover-up of Jessica's crimes. The comprehensive nature of the consequences also provided a powerful deterrent effect that would discourage other wealthy families from attempting to use their resources to cover up child abuse. The complete destruction of my family's wealth, social status, and freedom demonstrated that systematic obstruction of justice in abuse cases would ultimately result in more severe consequences than accepting accountability for the original crimes. As I reviewed the final financial statements showing the distribution of restitution payments to all of Jessica's victims, I realized that the consequences phase of our fight had accomplished something beyond individual justice for Emma and the other children who had been harmed. The systematic destruction of my family's criminal network had created lasting changes that would protect countless future victims from similar abuse and cover-up tactics. The courthouse steps where Ada Mitchell had first announced the charges against my family had become a gathering place for other survivors of family abuse who drew inspiration from our successful fight for justice. The message was clear and powerful: wealth and social status could no longer protect predators from accountability, and systematic abuse would result in systematic consequences that would strip away every advantage criminal families had previously enjoyed. Emma and I had not only survived my family's campaign to destroy our lives, but we had transformed their systematic cover-up into a comprehensive demonstration of how justice could prevail when victims found the courage to speak truth to power. The consequences they faced would serve as both punishment for their crimes and protection for every child who might otherwise have become their next victim. 18 months after Jessica's sentencing, I sat in Dr. Sarah Chen's office watching Emma work on a puzzle while discussing her remarkable progress in recovering from the trauma she had endured at my family's hands. What struck me most powerfully about Emma's healing journey was not just her resilience in overcoming the abuse itself, but her growing understanding of the strength she had always possessed, even during her darkest moments. Dr. Chen, who specialized in treating children who had survived family abuse, had initially been concerned about Emma's ability to process the complex trauma of being systematically abused by people who were supposed to love and protect her. However, Emma's response to therapy had exceeded every expectation, revealing an inner core of strength that had somehow remained intact despite everything Jessica had done to her. During one particularly meaningful session, Emma had explained to Dr. Chen that she had never actually believed Jessica's claims that she was worthless or bad, because my love and consistent protection had taught her what real care looked like. Even during the worst moments of abuse, Emma had maintained an internal knowledge that Jessica's treatment of her was wrong, because she had experienced genuine love and safety in our relationship. This revelation had been transformative for my own healing process, as I realized that my efforts to protect and nurture Emma had created an unbreakable foundation that Jessica's cruelty could not destroy. The guilt I had carried about failing to protect Emma completely was replaced by gratitude that my love had given her the strength to survive and ultimately help expose the truth about our family's criminal behavior. Emma's recovery had been accelerated by her understanding that speaking out about her abuse had protected other children from experiencing similar harm. Dr. Chen explained that many young survivors struggled with guilt about their disclosure, but Emma felt proud that her courage had led to Jessica's imprisonment and prevented her from hurting additional victims. The most dramatic symbol of Emma's healing came when she asked to start taking piano lessons again, specifically requesting to use the same type of piano where Jessica had deliberately injured her fingers. When I expressed concern about potential trauma triggers, Emma explained that she wanted to transform the instrument from a source of pain into a tool for creating something beautiful. Her piano teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, was amazed by Emma's rapid progress and her emotional connection to the music she was learning to play. Emma had composed several simple pieces that she described as songs about being strong and protecting other people, demonstrating that her artistic expression had become a way of processing and integrating her traumatic experiences. Our family therapy sessions with Dr. Chen had also become opportunities for me to model healthy relationships and communication patterns that would help Emma develop appropriate expectations for how family members should treat each other. The contrast between our genuine caring relationship and the manipulation tactics my family had used became a powerful learning tool for Emma. Perhaps most importantly, Emma's healing process had taught both of us valuable lessons about recognizing and responding to manipulative behavior in future relationships. Dr. Chen had helped us develop specific strategies for identifying when someone was trying to use guilt, fear, or isolation to control our behavior, ensuring that we would never again be vulnerable to the sophisticated manipulation tactics my family had perfected. The support we received from the other survivors and their families had created an extended community of healing that provided ongoing validation and encouragement for Emma's recovery process. The children who had been abused by Jessica had formed friendships that were based on their shared experience of overcoming trauma, rather than the trauma itself, creating positive relationships that supported their continued growth. Thomas Richardson and Rebecca Martinez had both become mentors for Emma, showing her through their own successful adult lives that childhood abuse did not have to define or limit her future possibilities. Their examples of professional achievement and healthy relationships provided Emma with concrete evidence that survivors could build fulfilling lives despite their traumatic experiences. Emma's school performance had improved dramatically once she was free from the stress of hiding Jessica's abuse and dealing with my family's manipulation tactics. Her teachers reported that she had become more confident in classroom discussions, more willing to take creative risks in her artwork, and more empathetic in her interactions with classmates who were struggling with their own challenges. The most significant indicator of Emma's emotional healing was her decision to participate in a peer support program for children who had experienced family abuse, where she helped younger survivors understand that they were not alone, and that disclosure of abuse was an act of courage rather than betrayal. Her natural empathy and communication skills made her an effective advocate for other children who were beginning their own recovery journeys. Dr. Chen had explained that Emma's remarkable resilience was not unusual among children who had experienced consistent love and protection from at least one parent figure, even in the context of systematic abuse from other family members. The secure attachment we had maintained throughout her childhood had provided the emotional foundation necessary for her brain to process trauma without becoming overwhelmed or disconnected from reality. Our healing process had also included developing new family traditions and rituals that celebrated our strength and independence, rather than maintaining connections to the toxic family system we had escaped. Emma had chosen to change her last name to match mine through legal adoption proceedings, symbolically claiming her identity as part of our new family unit, rather than carrying forward the legacy of her abusers. The financial security provided by the restitution payments had removed the economic stress that often complicated recovery from family abuse, allowing us to focus completely on healing without worrying about basic survival needs. Emma's college fund had grown substantially through careful investment, ensuring that her educational opportunities would reflect her potential rather than being limited by our family's criminal behavior. As I watched Emma confidently perform her first piano recital piece, a beautiful composition she had written about hope and healing, I realized that her recovery had transformed both of us in ways that went far beyond simply overcoming trauma. We had learned to trust our perceptions, value our own voices, and recognize our inherent worth, regardless of how others chose to treat us. The healing phase of our journey had taught us that love and consistent care could overcome even the most sophisticated forms of abuse and manipulation. Emma's strength had not only survived my family's attempts to destroy it, but had ultimately become the force that brought justice and protection to countless other victims. 5 years after Jessica's sentencing, I stood in the conference room of the nonprofit organization we had established to support families fighting institutional abuse, surrounded by photographs and testimonials from hundreds of survivors who had found the courage to seek justice because of Emma's story. The Emma Foundation had grown from our personal fight for accountability into a national resource that provided legal assistance expert testimony and emotional support for families challenging wealthy predators and their enablement systems. Emma, now 11 years old and radiating the confidence that comes from knowing she survived something terrible and used that experience to protect others, was preparing to address our annual conference of survivors, advocates, and legal professionals who were working to reform how child abuse cases involving powerful defendants were investigated and prosecuted. The Foundation's work had supported successful prosecutions of abuse cases in 12 states, resulting in convictions of 37 predators and their enablers who had previously escaped accountability through wealth, social connections, and systematic intimidation of victims. Our legal assistance program had helped families navigate complex court proceedings, while our expert witness network provided testimony that challenged defense attempts to discredit young survivors. But perhaps the most important aspect of our foundation's mission was demonstrating to other families that fighting back against systematic abuse was not only possible, but necessary to protect future generations of children. The comprehensive victory we had achieved against my family's criminal conspiracy had become a blueprint that other families could follow when confronting their own institutional abuse situations. Emma's role in the foundation reflected her natural evolution from victim to advocate, as she had discovered that helping other children find their voices gave additional meaning to her own survival and recovery. Her age-appropriate involvement in supporting younger survivors had accelerated her healing, while providing hope and inspiration to families who were just beginning their own fights for justice. The ripple effects of our original case continued to expand as new victims of my family's network were identified and supported through the Foundation's resources. Margaret had become our organization's Director of Investigation Services, using her decades of documentation experience to help other families gather the comprehensive evidence needed to pursue criminal charges against sophisticated predators. Dr. Williams had joined our medical advisory board and had trained dozens of pediatricians in recognizing and documenting signs of systematic abuse, creating a network of healthcare professionals who could provide expert testimony in complex cases. Her protocols for identifying abuse patterns had been adopted by children's hospitals throughout the region and had led to the identification of previously undetected predators. The legislative changes inspired by our case had been replicated in multiple states, creating legal frameworks that made it much more difficult for wealthy families to use their resources to obstruct justice in child abuse investigations. Emma's law had been expanded to include provisions requiring financial institutions to report suspicious transactions that might be related to victim intimidation or witness tampering. Our Foundation's educational programs had reached thousands of parents, teachers, and community leaders, providing training in recognizing sophisticated grooming tactics and understanding how institutional protection of predators could be challenged through coordinated advocacy efforts. The curriculum Emma had helped develop for age-appropriate abuse prevention had been implemented in school districts across multiple states. The most profound lesson we had learned through our journey from victims to advocates was that protecting children from systematic abuse required more than individual courage. It demanded collective action that could overcome the advantages, wealth, and social status typically provided to predators and their enablement networks. My experience of confronting a family system that prioritized reputation over children's safety had taught me that silence and accommodation in the face of abuse actually enabled escalation that put additional children at risk. Breaking my family's cycle of abuse required destroying their ability to intimidate victims and witnesses through financial pressure and social manipulation. Emma's healing had taught us both that recovery from systematic abuse was not about forgetting or forgiving the harm that had been done, but about transforming traumatic experiences into sources of strength that could be used to protect other vulnerable people. Her decision to use her voice to support other survivors had created meaning from suffering, while demonstrating that children could be powerful advocates for justice. The Foundation's work had also revealed how many families were struggling in isolation against similar patterns of systematic abuse by wealthy predators who relied on victims' fear of challenging their superior resources. Our success in completely destroying my family's criminal network had provided a model that other families could adapt to their own circumstances and legal jurisdictions. Perhaps most importantly, our fight had demonstrated that love and determination could ultimately overcome even the most sophisticated systems of abuse and cover up when supported by comprehensive evidence, gathering strategic alliance building, and persistent pursuit of accountability through appropriate legal channels. Emma's story had become proof that children who experience consistent love and protection from at least one caring adult could not only survive systematic abuse, but could transform their experiences into forces for positive change that protected countless other children. Her resilience had inspired legislative reforms, institutional policy changes, and cultural shifts in how abuse allegations involving wealthy defendants were investigated and prosecuted. The life lesson that emerged from our 5-year journey was that protecting vulnerable children from systematic abuse required communities willing to prioritize children's safety over social harmony, institutions willing to pursue accountability regardless of defendants' wealth or status, and legal systems designed to prevent predators from using their resources to escape consequences for their crimes. As I listened to Emma address the conference audience about the importance of believing children who disclose abuse and supporting families who have the courage to challenge powerful predators, I realized that our personal fight for justice had evolved into a legacy that would protect future generations of children from experiencing the systematic abuse we had survived. Have you or someone you know ever faced a situation where speaking up felt impossible because of power imbalances or family pressure? Emma's courage to break the silence ultimately protected countless other children, proving that even young voices can create powerful change when supported properly. What do you think gives people the strength to stand up against systematic abuse, and how can communities better support families who are fighting for justice? Thank you for following Emma's journey from victim to survivor to advocate. Her story reminds us that healing is possible, justice can prevail, and that love really can overcome even the most sophisticated forms of abuse when we refuse to remain silent. If this story touched your heart or inspired you to think differently about protecting vulnerable children, please like this video, subscribe to hear more stories of survival and justice, and share Emma's message with others who might need to know that speaking truth to power is always worth the fight.